Diesel had never barked at anyone on Millbrook Lane in 18 months. That was the fact that bothered Hayes Cole from the beginning, the fact that kept circling back no matter how many times he apologized to the neighbors and put the dog inside. Diesel did not bark. He was an 8-year-old retired police K-9 who had worked the streets of Flagstaff for 6 years and had been trained, in that time, to distinguish between the sounds and smells that required response and the ones that didn't, and he had never once confused the categories. He did not bark at mail carriers. He did not bark at children on bikes. He did not bark at the Hendersons' new car, or the sound of the Garcias' lawnmower, or any of the other 1,000 stimuli that neighborhood dogs treated as cause for announcement. He had been on Millbrook Lane for 18 months, and had been indistinguishable from the kind of dog that is simply there, present, calm, observant, unremarkable, until Derek Callum moved into number 14. Then Diesel barked. Every time, without exception. At 6 in the morning when Callum's recycling went to the curb. At 11 when Callum walked to his mailbox. At 4 in the afternoon when Callum pulled into his driveway. Not a warning bark, not territorial noise. The specific, persistent bark of an animal that is communicating something and has not yet been heard. Hayes did not know why. He would understand it in 3 weeks. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. We read every single comment. What Diesel knew about the man 2 houses down, and what it cost that street to find out, is the kind of story that changes how you look at the person who moved in next door. Gunnery Sergeant Hayes Cole, retired, was 44 years old and had been living on Millbrook Lane in Flagstaff, Arizona for 3 years, long enough to know which neighbors waved and which didn't, which houses kept their porch lights on, and where the Hendersons hid their spare key, which he had been told about during a power outage and had not forgotten, because he did not forget things related to the security of people in his care. He was 6 feet exactly, 185, with close-cropped dark hair and a jaw that had a slight asymmetry from a fracture taken in Helmand Province in 2014 that had healed in a way that looked deliberate, like a detail added by someone who understood that faces should show where they've been. His eyes were a deep, steady hazel, not the green hazel of someone whose eyes change with the light, but the fixed hazel of someone who has made up their mind about most things and is not re-examining them. The eyes of a man who pays attention in the specific way that men pay attention when paying attention has been, for most of their adult life, the difference between alive and not. He had served 21 years in the United States Marine Corps as a Force Reconnaissance Marine with 1st Marine Raider Battalion, Fallujah in 2005, Helmand Province twice, a classified rotation in Somalia in 2016, and a 4th deployment in Iraq's Anbar Province in 2019 that had been his last. Not because anything went wrong, but because the thing that had been building quietly for several deployments finally arrived, which was the understanding that he had given what he had to give, and it was time to give it differently. He had retired with a Bronze Star, and the particular stillness of a man who has arrived at the end of a long effort and is figuring out what rest is supposed to feel like. Millbrook Lane was part of that figuring. He mowed his lawn. He watched his neighbors' houses when they traveled. He had the sticky note system, which had been his idea, a small pad by his front door where he wrote down things his neighbors told him when they were worried about something. Because older people were often worried about things that seemed small to someone else and large to them. And worrying alone about small things was the beginning of a process that could end badly. He had Diesel, who was more effective than any sticky note system. Diesel was 8 years old and 88 pounds, with a coat that ran from deep black along his spine and ears to a rich gold at his chest and paws. The specific coloring of a German Shepherd, who has been working outdoors for years in a way that the son has noticed. He had a scar along his left front leg where a vehicle had clipped him during a foot pursuit on Route 66 in 2019. And the scar had knitted into a clean raised line that he bore with the complete indifference of an animal that considers physical evidence of work to be unremarkable. He had been retired from the Flagstaff Police Department K-9 unit after the leg injury required a recovery that the department's protocol did not accommodate past a specific window, and Hayes had adopted him through the department's program 18 months ago. Diesel had been through enough with the Flagstaff PD that the transition from patrol to residence had required a specific kind of patience from Hayes. Not the patience of waiting for the dog to calm down, but the patience of allowing the dog to remain exactly what he was, and trusting that what he was would be sufficient. It was. Millbrook Lane was a residential street of 19 houses in a neighborhood that had been built in the early 1970s and had been owned mostly by the same families for decades. The houses were single-story, with front porches and low fences and mature trees that provided the kind of shade that takes 40 years to produce, and that real estate listings describe as a feature, and that longtime residents simply take for granted as part of what home is. The air in Flagstaff in late September had the specific quality of high-altitude autumn, cool in the mornings, warm by noon, and carrying the smell of pine from the national forest that began 4 miles north of Millbrook Lane, and that perfumed the whole town with something that people who moved there often said they'd never smelt anywhere else. The neighbors on Millbrook Lane knew each other in the way that neighbors on streets like this know each other. Not intimately, but specifically. They knew who had recently lost someone, and who was putting on a good face about it. They knew whose mail to pick up, and whose trash to wheel back from the curb if the wind came up. 3 doors east of Hayes lived Edna Marsh, 78 years old, who had taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 blocks over for 31 years, and who had known most of the adults on the block when they were children, which gave her a specific standing that nobody on the street had ever had to articulate, because it was simply present. The way certain things are present on a street that has had time to become what it is. She had a front garden that she maintained herself, on her knees in the morning before it got hot, and she made bread every Sunday that appeared on 3 or 4 porches by mid-afternoon. She had a telephone and a sharp mind, and the specific caution of a woman who has lived alone for a long time and has made her peace with it without ever making peace with the things that can happen to people who are old and live alone. She had a sticky note by her phone that said, "Don't wire money without calling Hayes first." Hayes had written it for her 6 months ago, after a conversation about a phone call she'd received that she'd found persuasive, and then suspicious, and then frightening. He'd written it as a general precaution, a reminder that the first impulse and the right impulse are not always the same thing, and that a second opinion costs nothing. Edna had put it where she could see it from her phone chair, and had pointed to it when she told Hayes about it, with the specific pride of someone who has made a sensible arrangement and is satisfied by the evidence of it. Derek Callum had moved into number 14 in the first week of September. He was 46, plausible-looking, well-maintained in the way of a man who understood that appearance was a professional asset, with a practiced warmth that the street had accepted at face value, as streets accept most things that look like they belong there. He had introduced himself on move-in day with a box of donuts and a handshake, and 3 neighbors had described him to Hayes that first week as a nice man. He had gone to Edna's door on the 3rd day to return her mail, which had been misdelivered to his box, and he had stood on her porch for 20 minutes in a conversation she had later described to Hayes as pleasant. He had a name she had not verified, and a history she could not have known. Derek Callum was not his legal name. His legal name was Michael Pratt, and under that name and 2 others he had 3 prior convictions in Arizona and Nevada for wire fraud and elder financial exploitation, the most recent from 4 years ago, for which he had served 11 months and been released on probation that had expired in January. He had moved to Millbrook Lane because Millbrook Lane was a street of mostly older residents in a quiet neighborhood, which was the specific demographic he had been targeting with phone investment schemes for 6 years. And because a man who learns from his mistakes learns, among other things, to choose a cover that fits. He had a prepaid cell phone and a script, and the patience of someone who understood that trust is built slowly, and that slowly is worth it. Diesel had met Callum at a public K9 demonstration in Flagstaff 18 months earlier, a department event where the dog had been present as part of a community engagement program, during which a man matching Callum's description and scent had been briefly detained in connection with a noise complaint near the event, and then released. Callum's scent was in Diesel's memory not as a threat, but as a flag, the specific olfactory imprint of a person the K9 unit had briefly assessed. Diesel had never forgotten it. When Callum moved to Millbrook Lane, the dog recognized him the first morning. He barked. Hayes tried to explain it away. He apologized to 3 neighbors in the first week. He put Diesel inside when Callum was visible. He tried different routes for the morning walk to avoid the front of number 14. He told himself this was territorial behavior, adjustment stress, something the dog would work through. He told himself this for 2 weeks. And then on a Tuesday evening he was at Edna's door returning a casserole dish she'd left on his porch, and Edna mentioned, in the way people mention things they're not sure how to characterize, that she had been on the phone with a very knowledgeable man about an investment opportunity that had looked very promising, and she had almost sent a wire transfer that afternoon, and then she had looked at the note by the phone. Hayes looked at the note. Then he looked at Edna. "Tell me about the man," he said. He didn't know yet what Diesel had been trying to tell him for 2 weeks. He would understand it in 11 days. Edna described 3 phone calls, each one building on the previous, each one moving her a step further toward the belief that the opportunity was real and the urgency was genuine. The 3rd call had asked for a wire transfer of $12,000. She had looked at the note by the phone. She had hung up. The man had called back. She had not answered. He had left a voicemail she described as disappointed in me, which was the specific phrase that told Hayes everything about what he was dealing with, and nothing he could prove yet. He called the Flagstaff PD non-emergency line that evening. He gave them his name and his background, and the description of what Edna had told him. He asked whether there had been any similar complaints on Millbrook Lane or in the neighborhood. The officer on the line said she would check and call back. She called back in 20 minutes. There had been one other complaint, filed 3 days earlier, by a neighbor at the other end of Millbrook Lane, a 73-year-old man named Gerald Fitch, who had also been called by a persuasive man with investment information, and who had also not sent money, and who had mentioned, when he called the non-emergency line, that he found the persistent barking of the dog at number 11 notable and worth reporting. The officer who took Gerald's complaint had run the address of number 14 as a standard check. The name registered there, Derek Callum, had not produced a record. But the physical description Gerald provided, cross-referenced with the timing of the move-in and the complaint pattern, had generated a flag in the fraud unit's active case file. The fraud unit had been looking for Michael Pratt for 4 months. Diesel's barking had appeared in the non-emergency call log as a neighbor complaint. It had been the detail that connected Gerald's report to the right detective. Hayes did not know this when he hung up the non-emergency line. He found out 11 days later. What he knew that evening was that Edna had nearly been defrauded, and had not been, because of a sticky note, and because she had the habit of calling Hayes before doing anything that scared her. He knew that his dog had been barking at the man 2 houses down for 3 weeks. He knew that the barking had not been wrong. The morning of the arrest, Hayes was on his porch at 7:45 when he saw Callum loading his car. Not the loading of a man going to the grocery store, the systematic, deliberate loading of someone who has decided to be somewhere else before the day proceeds further. Hayes had watched evacuations and extractions in 3 countries, and he knew what departure that is trying not to look like departure looks like. Diesel, at his left heel, went still. His ears came forward. His body dropped slightly at the shoulders, not the aggressive drop of a dog preparing to attack, but the deliberate drop of a dog that has located something and is making sure Hayes sees it. Hayes walked off his porch. He did not run. He walked across the street in the unhurried way of a man who has covered ground in every condition and knows that urgency and speed are not the same thing. He was 6 feet and 21 years of service, and the morning was quiet, except for the sound of his boots on asphalt, and, behind him, the sound of 2 neighbors opening their front doors, because doors open when something is happening on a street that people know. Callum looked up from his trunk. Diesel walked forward and sat down on the sidewalk between Callum and his car. He looked at Callum with the steady, amber-eyed attention of an animal that has been right about something for 3 weeks and is waiting for the humans to arrive at the same conclusion. He did not bark. He had barked enough. He had been heard. "Leaving town?" Hayes said. Callum looked at Hayes. He looked at Diesel. He looked at the 2 neighbors on their porches, Edna to the east, Gerald Fitch to the west, both of them watching with the particular attentiveness of people who have suspected something and are waiting to have the suspicion confirmed. He looked at the car with the trunk open and the bags half loaded. "My plans changed," Callum said. "I'd like you to wait," Hayes said. He said it the way he had said things on 4 deployments, when he needed something to happen without negotiation, not a request and not a threat. Simply the statement of a person who has made a decision and is giving someone the opportunity to agree with it. "The people I called last night are on their way." Callum looked at him for a long time. He looked at Diesel. The dog looked back with the complete, unhurried patience of a retired police K9 who has all the time in the world and has already done the hardest part. 2 Flagstaff PD vehicles arrived on Millbrook Lane at 8:04. A detective and 2 officers. The detective's name was Rosa Medina, and she walked to where Hayes was standing with Diesel, and she looked at the dog before she looked at Hayes. And she said, "He's a Flagstaff dog?" "Was," Hayes said. 18 months retired. She nodded once. Then she went to speak with Callum. The arrest took 11 minutes. Edna Marsh stood on her porch through all of it, with her hands folded in front of her, watching the man who had called her 3 times with the practiced patience of someone who thought she wouldn't remember the note by the phone. Gerald Fitch came down his front steps and stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching the man be walked to the police vehicle. And then he caught Hayes's eye and nodded in the way that men nod when something that needed to happen has happened and there are not really words for the relief of it. Michael Pratt, also known as Derek Callum and 2 previous aliases, was charged with wire fraud, identity fraud, and elder financial exploitation. The fraud unit documented contact with 9 residents on Millbrook Lane and 4 surrounding blocks, of whom 3 had been defrauded of sums totaling $46,000 over the prior 2 months. He was convicted on 6 counts. He was sentenced to 7 years. The $9,000 that had been transferred out of one neighbor's account, a retired school teacher named Norma Chu, who lived on the street perpendicular to Millbrook and who had not known to call anyone before she wired it, was recovered through Pratt's seized accounts. It took 4 months, but it came back. Detective Medina called Hayes 3 days after the arrest. She told him about Gerald Fitch's non-emergency call. She told him about the barking detail in the complaint log. She told him how the flag had propagated through the fraud unit's system to the active case file for Michael Pratt. "Your dog's bark is in the investigative chain of custody," she said. Hayes thought about that for a moment. "He's been trying to tell me for 3 weeks," he said. "Most of them are," Medina said. "Most of us just aren't listening right." 4 months later, on a warm January afternoon in Flagstaff, Hayes sat on his front porch with his coffee going cool in the sun, and Diesel stretched across the boards at his feet, in the specific boneless way of a dog that has decided this is the warmest spot available and is committing to it. Edna Marsh was in her front garden, on her knees in the winter sun, tending to something that required attention in January in Arizona, and that Hayes had never fully understood but that always produced a result by March. She looked up at one point and waved at Hayes, and he raised his coffee cup. Diesel's tail moved twice against the porch boards, the slow, deliberate wag of a dog in a place it has decided it belongs. Number 14 was empty. The real estate listing had gone up in November. Nobody on the block had asked about the new tenants yet. They would in time. For now, the street was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place where something has been resolved and the resolution has had time to settle. Sometimes the warning arrives before we're ready to hear it. Sometimes it arrives as a dog barking at a neighbor we've already decided is fine, and the dog barks again and again and again, not because the dog doesn't know what it's doing, but because the dog knows exactly what it's doing and is waiting for the people around it to stop explaining it away. We are in the habit of assuming that our judgment is better than an animal's instinct. Sometimes it is. And sometimes God gives an old police dog a scent memory that no human in the neighborhood had, and a persistence that no neighbor managed, and the only thing required of the rest of us is to stop putting the dog inside and start asking why it keeps barking. The hardest part of listening is stopping the noise we make trying not to hear. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the ones watching over us sometimes bark when we'd rather they didn't, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever had an animal try to tell you something you weren't ready to hear? We'd like to hear that story. And if you believe that loyalty shows up in the forms we need rather than the forms we expect, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep you listening to the warnings that arrive in the forms that surprise you.